Hello, my name is Yaya. Thank you for tuning into Trauma and God. I know from personal experience that healing from a black cloud trauma is possible. It just takes time. Just as in nature, there is always sunlight behind a dark cloud. So it is for us. God is light and He's always there. We just have to find Him. In this series, I talk about things that hinder us from finding the light and things we can do that help us overcome obstacles. Today's subject is stages of refugee trauma. The dictionary defines the word refugee as a person who has been forced to leave their country in order to escape war, persecution, or natural disaster. My family escaped war and became refugees. In hindsight, I see that the trauma of becoming a refugee did not happen in one day. It's not one, but several traumas, with each trauma being distinct in its own way. I'm fully aware that someone else may have a very different experience. This is my story. Trauma one was the violence that came before our evacuation. Up until I was 9, we lived in Asia. Most of my formative years were spent in a town in the northwest corner of Irian Jaya. We were far from our natural family, as were all the other inhabitants, and we relied on each other and formed a very close-knit, tight community. My days were spent going to school in the morning and then going to the beach with my friends in the afternoon. I felt safe and I was very happy. Behind the scenes, though, great trouble began brewing in our paradise. Soon neighbors would come by for coffee, and their talk would always turn to the political situation or our safety or the possibility of war. Father's work took him away for very long periods at a time, so mother was left alone with us 4 children. One day, mother found an intruder in our home, and subsequently, father came home and brought 2 guard dogs with him. One mysteriously got lost, was probably stolen, but Blackie, our jet black Bouvier, was gentle, loyal, and very clever. He was tied by a long, hefty rope to the outside of our house, and he could walk the whole perimeter of it and scare off strangers he hadn't been introduced to. But to us, he was loving and gentle, and we adored playing with him. Well, daily, the sound of gunfire in the jungle grew closer. More troops were sent into the jungle surrounding the 3 sides of our town. I mean, friendly troops who were there to protect us. And we were now prohibited from going to the beach. One afternoon, I was playing in our backyard when I heard a single shot. I ran into our house and told my mother that our senior policeman, like the chief of police, who was a friend of our family and father of our favorite babysitter, had been killed. I showed her where he was killed by pointing into the jungle and told her how he'd been taken up to heaven. Later we heard that he was indeed killed just where I had shown my mother he was killed. I think by this, God was reassuring me that I could hear his voice. Well, the harassment continued. One night, Blackie was untied by someone, lured out of our yard, and shot. We woke up to find him dead and lying by our gate. I was distraught. hugged him for a long time. Mother felt it was a bit silly and kept saying, "It's just a dog." I ran to our neighbor for solace. Our neighbor let me cry and cry. Soon after this, early in the morning, there was a loud banging on our front door. A voice of authority shouted out that the situation had become too dangerous and troops had come to evacuate us with immediate effect. They had put up collapsible tables in the street, and the soldier was seated behind each table to record names, addresses, numbers in the family, relatives back home. I really don't know what else. In the process, I felt God's hand on my life. I was protected by one particular soldier. He guided me onto the troop transporter. He sat next to me. He even tried to shield my eyes when we drove through bare, battle-scorched patches of jungle where some dead civilians lay in ditches, waiting for collection. I've always thought of him as an angel sent to protect me. Well, trauma number 2 was the transit sites and travel. Father was not with us, and we had no idea where he was. Mother held on to my 5-year-old twin brothers, one suitcase, and passports and important documents. My sister and I followed, empty-handed behind her. My parents were different nationalities and held different passports. We children had my father's nationality, and he wasn't with us. It added great confusion in transit. I wondered if we would be taken from Mother or if she would be taken from us. At the airport, there were more desks and lines, more confusion over our mixed nationalities. We were taken to a transit site in Singapore, more lines, more desks, more form filling, more confusion of nationalities. We had another transit stay in India before finally being repatriated to the Netherlands. We landed in late January. There was snow on the ground. 2 of my aunts were waiting at the base of our KLM airplane steps, holding open, warm, woolen winter coats. My sister and I still wore our summer dresses, but Mother had found our shoes somewhere. My aunt wrapped me in a coat as I sobbed, and I told her of our evacuation story. When I paused for breath, she said I was to never speak of it again. I thought I had said something terribly bad. Trauma number 3 was our temporary reprieve. My sister and I were left with an aunt and her family. I loved her. She was firm, loving, and probably much more affectionate than my mother. I was familiar with the culture, the language, the foods in Holland, and was now surrounded by my extended family. I integrated on some level as best as I could. I was a difficult child. I had nightmares. I barely slept. I prayed a lot. And I found that at some point, God gave me good sleep. He also gave me dreams that filled me with hope for my future. Aunt ruled her household with a firm hand, and the occasional visits from my mother or my father ended in verbal clashes. It was hard to listen to the fighting. My aunt had very strong ideas about what my parents should do next. And my parents disagreed with her equally as strongly. Trauma number 4 was integration into another culture. My father was very happy to have found employment, and he must have, at that point, applied for immigration status as refugees long before he told us where we were going. I was 10 and a half years old. Within a year, we'd evacuated from our home in the Far East, lost all our possessions. Father lost his business and work. And now, having found solace and love in our extended family, we were being moved away from them, far away, I thought, to England. We said goodbye and left the warmth of loved ones to wander out into the cold. It was my first time in this country. It rained a lot. We were alone and lonely refugees in a country I didn't know. Here they spoke a different language. They had strange customs, at least they were to me. They stood in line behind each other when they waited, and they drove on the wrong side of the road. Nothing was comforting or familiar. Absolutely nothing. Mother, I said, I can't speak English. What do I say tomorrow when I go to school? I was a total mixture of emotions. There was fear. I was distraught. I felt lost. I was crying. I needed help. I needed a hug. I needed perhaps permission to stay home because I suddenly felt very sick. I needed anything. But Mother, in her no-nonsense way, didn't give me a reassuring hug, but an answer to my question. She said, all you have to say is, what is this? Off I went to my new school in England, armed with my 3-word sentence, what is this? Wearing my brand new school uniform, I was seated in the back of the classroom next to a girl who was obviously my mentor. I'd pick up an item from my desk and say, what is this? Ruler was the first word I knew. I soon found out that in England, a ruler is a multi-purpose tool. Not only can it measure, it can draw straight lines, and it can be used to rap naughty little boys across their knuckles. I was now forbidden to speak in my native language at home. All conversation had to be in English. I'm sure this was done in an attempt to help us learn English more quickly. But I felt like my arms had been cut off. It felt like a physical pain to me. At school, I was frequently called into the nurse's office. We were treated as nice children who had very troublesome parents who were incapable of keeping proper records. We lacked academic records. We lacked vaccination records. We lacked medical records. In their practical and no-nonsense British way, the school made sure a paper trail was started for us. We had vaccines, eye tests, hearing tests, intelligence tests. Well, my Norwegian grandfather was a stickler for courtesy and respect and had instilled politeness in us children, in the sense of manners maketh a man or a woman. And I liked that. I knew where I stood with that. Through him, I saw manners were not just about what I did, but how I could make those around me feel comfortable with me. When we lived in different countries and traveled through others, I tried to respect their culture. I particularly tried to note how they greeted each other and how they ate their food. It had become a game for me, and now I applied it to living in England. With great zeal and determination, I set about learning to speak English in what I deemed to be good English, which to me meant English without a strong foreign accent. Both my parents spoke English with strong accents. In fact, my father could speak 8 languages. While father's work took him abroad for months on end, mother hated everything about England. The unhealthy food, the rain, the architecture, the abundance of floral fabrics. She wasn't shy about sharing her feelings either. It didn't stop there. She also added how she hated my father, hated her father, hated me. And she continually told me so. In trying to protect herself, she shamelessly tore down all the people around her because of her loss of control, her loss of identity. Mother was very touchy and easily annoyed. She felt she was misunderstood, disliked, didn't fit in, and she projected this on those around her. She was always questioning what she called stupid British rules and balked at following them. She became angry, resentful, spiteful, and I would say even vindictive. In senior school, I started to talk of my war experience and becoming a refugee in a country far from England, and which my contemporaries had never heard of. Conversations soon turned to me being called a liar. Again, I learned to keep quiet about my experience. In this atmosphere, I had to find my own footing. Initially, I took on some of my mother's dislikes of England because I didn't feel at home either. I felt a wanderer. I was lost and thought I would never feel settled anywhere in the world. When I fell in love with and married an Englishman, though, finding my identity became a serious issue, and I became very zealous in learning everything about England. From its museums to its cuisine to its various landscapes and to its distinct local accents. I enjoyed it all. I wanted to fit in and feel at home. I chose to give up my nationality and become British. Like my husband, I didn't want my children fearing I might be taken away from them at some immigration checkpoint in the future, as I had with my mother. I soon became familiar with British culture, and I came to love it. I was not like my mother, who found everything wrong with England. I didn't want to condemn, but to love the country, which had showed kindness to me as a child. I'm very grateful to have been taken in as refugees by England. For showing love to me, my heart grew to love England in return. My 5th trauma was in becoming an immigrant. My husband was offered a job in the US, and we moved with our children to our new homeland. We were not refugees. We'd come by invitation. We had a job. We had green cards, and we'd chosen to go, and we arrived initially as resident aliens. At that time, I didn't realize that there is little emotional difference between being a refugee and arriving as a resident alien. For both, you leave your family environment, you're very alone, you're facing long lines at immigration desks, you have challenges with the new culture, with your identity, and with assimilating into the new culture. I was emotionally raw on our arrival, but far too busy attending to the needs of my children to think about it. I knew what to do. You get to know the customs of the nation and learn to respect their culture. I had a nagging feeling I would always be a transient visitor and never be able to settle down. In hindsight, I see that I was thrown into my refugee PTSD. A few years later, we returned from a visit to England, seeing family. At his desk, an arrogant immigration officer made me aware that any infringement of the law would immediately send me back to England. I went into total shock, believing that at any moment I could be separated from those I loved and was taking care of. In my mind, I envisioned eyes in the sky watching my every move, and convinced myself that they were invisible, but they were following me. Inwardly, I was paranoid and made sure I followed every rule. Well, after the required time, we became dual citizens. And I was finally able to put this at an end and deal with that fear. Well, as I reflect on my life, I see that my heart has enlarged to embrace many countries. I'm still not sure to which country I belong, as my focus has been so much on not knowing where I belong. Maybe I've just missed the point. Maybe the point all along has been to shift my focus to my gains. It has been a privilege for me to live in many countries and to have traveled to more. My heart has been enlarged because of it. And God, after all, loves every country in the world and every person in it. I've not understood all that refugee trauma did to my emotions, and I may never. In the meantime, I do what I can to strengthen my relationship with God. My identity lies in Him. I've taken time to learn about God, the heavenly place where He lives, the languages He speaks. I've learned about His customs and have learned and fallen in love with His chosen nation, Israel. I have applied the same seal to understanding God as I did to my arrival in England, and then having to learn a new language, new customs, and creating a new identity when I married an Englishman. Being a refugee can be broken down into stages, each with its own trauma. I was not always aware of this. Psalm 23 says this so eloquently. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. By the way, a shepherd feeds and guides and protects his sheep. Later on, the psalm goes on, even though I walk through the sunless valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and staff, they comfort and console me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You have anointed and refreshed my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy and unfailing love shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell forever in the house and in the presence of the Lord. Please subscribe and tell others if you found this vlog helpful. You may email me, Yaya, at traumaandgod@gmail.com, or read my personal stories, Snakes in the Loo, at Amazon Books. If this stirs things in you, please reach out and talk to a mental health professional. In the US, help is also available at the following: Suicide and Crisis Helpline, 1-800-273-8255. Or there's the Rape, Abuse and Incest National Network. Their helpline is 1-800-656-4673. God is for you, and so am I. I will see you next Thursday at 10. Bye-bye.